Okay, so I want to keep going into these. I want to go into more of these conflicts in the 1820s, 1830s, into the 1840s. Again, a lot of the conflicts you have to remember as liberalism tends to be breaking up into various factions, right? Whenever we speak of the moderate liberals, we mean the moderate liberals. They tend to be followers of John Locke, right? Adam Smith. The individual is the most important person. There should be a political system based on checks and balances, a constitution that protects liberties, especially economic liberties of the property class. There should be limits on government. The limits on government ultimately help to protect, especially the business class. Radical liberals, they also want limits on government, but they want limits also on the business class. And both moderate and radical liberals tend to be, indifferent to religion, towards hostile to religion. For the most part, I mean, there's exceptions, but for the most part, they're either ambiguous towards religion, or they see that religion needs to somehow be controlled by the state. And this is part of the dilemma that de Lamennais raises. This is, de Lamennais, he puts his finger on a real tension, because they want to promote freedom and God and social justice. And in the beginning, they're doing it to promote the freedom of the church. But they raise this question, how much should we coddle the liberal promoters of Enlightenment freedom, who base their understanding of the human person on John Locke, where the primary political question is no longer one of authority and justice, but one of just how do you make legitimacy for a government. In the modern era, legitimacy really replaces, I think, authority as like the fundamental problem of government. Right? It's not can you establish an authority and exercise it, but is this government legitimate? And if it's legitimate, can it do whatever it wants? And also this question, de Lamennais, I mean, he leads many people to really ask this question. Is it worth promoting freedom if in the end, by promoting freedom, we end up increasing the power of the business class, as we see happening in Britain or in the American system? And initially, both in France and in Spain, in France, the constitution of under Louis Philippe, right after Napoleon, before Charles X, and also in Spain, in Cadiz, the constitution of 1812, the principles of moderate liberalism win out. And for the moderate liberals, again, the moderate liberals, they start to see there's a real power in banking. There's a real power in economics and finance, and there's also a real power in public relations. I think an author who really comes to see this well, and he describes it he describes the variables in very, I think, prescient terms, is Thorstein Veblen. He was a kind of a political theorist, social theorist. His career more or less went from 1900 to 1920. I think for most of that time, he was at the University of Chicago. Somehow, if you don't, and I think also for moderate liberals, if you're not like kicking out the Jesuits, you still need to neutralize or control religion in some way. And as we've said before, in the United States and Great Britain, the solution to neutralizing religion was multiplying sects. Right? Encouraging sects to combat each other so that there'd be no idea of there being one truth. In Europe, they can't take that approach, because in Europe and in Latin America, They can't take that. The liberals cannot take that approach. Why? Because the vast majority of people, there's this great weight of religious people, especially Catholics. Even in Germany, most provinces in Germany are still divided up into Catholic and Protestant. So they see that you have this great weight of Catholic culture. It's too big. You have to work on it over time. If you open up the vote to a majority vote, what the future Blessed Pius IX said was right. If you just have strict democracy, they'll vote for Catholic ideals. So for example, leading up to the Garibaldi's taking over of Italy in 1870, every time in the Papal States they had a vote for whether the people in the Papal States wanted to stick with the Pope or go with a unified Italy. They voted to stick with the Pope. Right? So the people foiled the plans of the liberals who wanted to unify Italy. In an American context, so I have a friend who was writing he was in the history department, and he showed me these memos he got from the CIA from the 1950s. So he was writing a biography of Luce. Henry Luce was the owner, or the publisher of Time magazine, of Sports Illustrated, Life magazine, and I think a few others. I mean, he was a big publisher. Well, in his career, that we know now that in his career, he started working very closely with the CIA. And so my friend who was doing this research, he came across this document it was like a CIA document of Luce, CIA, and Catholicism. It was something like that. But so whatever that document was, he asked for the document, and he got the document, and the document said Luce, CIA, Catholicism, and everything else was blacked out. And the reason for the blackout was these many of the things described in this memo are still in practice to this day. This was in 2006 or 7. So he sued. My friend sued. And this is not my friend who shall not be named. This is a history professor at Notre Dame. So he sued. He thought, well, this is really interesting. I just want to find out. He was just kind of curious, like, what's going on here? So he sued, and he lost the first suit. Because you can sue. There's certain courts you can go to sue, to have the CIA or government lift the black off of documents. So the first time he sued, he got denied, or the way he was given approval, it basically just got enough to say like the year, and said something about Catholic universities, Catholic publications, and then that's it. So then he sued again. He said, and basically the second time he sued, he said, look, whatever's going on between Luce, and then another name came out, C.D. Jackson. So he said, whatever's going on between Luce and C.D. Jackson, both those characters are dead by this point. So we're so far removed from the events that it can't be harmful. Even if some of those things, or we're still seeing the effects of some of those things, it can't be harmful at this point, right? To see like what's in the rest of the document. So in that case, he won. So they had to release the documents, and they had to lift the black. And it was really interesting because the CIA in this little thing, it led this guy to do a whole new project actually. But the document essentially said, we're going to work. We know that Catholics could be both Democrat or Republican. So we're going to work through secular journals, but also through Catholic institutions, universities, religious orders, and publications. We're going to work to promote division, to divide the Catholics amongst themselves by promoting heresy, schism, and dissent from church teaching. This was like in 1954. Right? So anyway.
Why did the CIA is interested in?
Because if you go back, going back, even you can see this even in the letters of John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. So I did a research project once in the letters between John Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. And then you can already see in the letters of John Adams in the 1820s that he's writing to Thomas Jefferson, he says, you can see now Irish immigrant on the uptick. All these Irish are starting to come to the United States. And they're all Catholic. And you can see that if the Catholics come to this country, they'll eventually outpopulate us. And they'll destroy everything that we've worked for. Right? So that fear that Adams, to his credit, as a principled man, he said to Jefferson, and we'll probably have to, if we're going to be consistent with our principles, we'll probably have to let them do it. So he was at least principled in that sense, even though maybe he misunderstood the nature of the Irish Catholics. Maybe he understood the nature of the Irish Catholics. But anyway, so there's always been this fear among the elite in the United States, and it gets very pronounced in the 1920s and 1930s, that Catholics will outpopulate everybody else and essentially take over the country and run it according to Catholic principles.
Mexicans.
Right? So there, there was this long-standing concern. How do you, and this concern became very pronounced in the 1920s, 1930s, and I think it actually led to I think you can see it led to certain policies being put in place to try to limit Catholic population and to trying to divide Catholics amongst themselves. Not just at the level of the CIA, but also among intellectual and cultural elites. So, but the reason I bring all this up is to say that, well, I think it's in the 1820s and 1830s that you start to see efforts, some of the first real efforts, to say among philosophical, literary elites, we have to do things that break up. In other words, we have to produce if we're going to have real democracy, we can't just have Catholics like voting as Catholics in real democracies. So we have to. So the idea they come up with in the 1820s and 30s is we have to produce a breakthrough moment. We have to come up with mechanisms of changing public opinion, especially changing public opinion leading up to an election that will produce electoral results that, at least for that moment, that breakthrough moment, will be favorable to moderate liberalism. So you start to see all these different efforts of people and groups trying to produce, using what we would now call public relations, right? Or psychological warfare or doctrinal warfare, right? A breakthrough moment, a breakthrough election, right? An epiphanic moment where you can somehow see in what the people are acting, the way the people are acting in this moment, the change that should be made for the future. One way this is done is through secret societies. There are secret societies that form at this time. Many of them, and some of the first ones in Italy are called the Carbonari. The Carbonari they're moderate liberals in France and in Switzerland and in Italy. They're interested ultimately in bringing about liberal reforms, but they want to do so under the appearance of appearing kind of Catholic, but also Catholic mixed in with something else. So actually, whether it's in France or Switzerland or Italy, they'll mix together in their symbolism, symbols of nature like the forest. But the forest, fraternity, but they might have like the forest and fraternity and a symbol of the Sacred Heart along in their shield as well, or something like that. They do have secret rituals. They oftentimes give the appearance of loving Catholicism, or they'll use Catholic symbols, but they don't really believe in them. The liberals start to see we need to, over time, we're going to need to influence music and dance. right? So they start to go to the, like for example, in Italy, they start to try to influence the opera. They get control of writing the lyrics of the singing houses in France. In Catalonia, they start certain dances. Just as another example here, Verdi's opera Nabucco, right? It's an opera that's all about waiting for a moment where true freedom breaks out. Chopin agreed to give tours that were called like liberation tours, you know. So what you're gonna, yeah, but it's descended to things like now, like what's going to happen in this election? They're going to resurrect all these grunge bands, right? They're going to resurrect all these. I bet you this year, next year, last year, all these grunge bands are going to, or heavy metal bands are going to be resurrected, and they're going to play. They're going to play concerts like on the Texas-Mexican border, right? As a way of trying to stoke through music anti-presidential sentiment for the election. You're going to see that kind of stuff happening. So that's just the modern version of Verdi's Nabucco. Or, death metal bands will do this too. I'm sure they'll get some death metal bands to do this too. Pearl Jam. You'll see the resurrection of Pearl Jam. Or Rage Against... I bet you a great band that'll come up again this year. Rage Against the Machine. They went into retirement in the Obama era. I bet you money Rage Against the Machine will try to put on a concert this year.
What's one Father Jack Reeves already?
Metallica.
Metallica.
Yeah, but Metallica, they're more Trumpistas, I think.
Oh.
I think actually Metallica would be more. I mean, that's just a guess. I don't know that. I mean, I don't know that much about them, but because Metallica is more like music for deplorables.
Okay.
The Vietnam vet that's been forgotten.
Good deplorable.
The Vietnam vet that's been forgotten. The drug addict that wants to be good but can't because he's weak and that kind of stuff. Also, they're looking for demonstrations, right? They're looking for events where they can basically use those events to try to produce the breakthrough moment. So, for example, there was this guy who had Lamarck. Lamarck was a guy that had connections back to the French Revolution. He died in 1832, and they tried to turn his funeral into a revolutionary event. They tried to make his funeral into a moment to bring out the colors of the revolution, to create a festival, to try to create the events in which finally the revolution could be brought to completion. We could break out into a new world.
Victor Hugo's funeral, was that one of those?
That was another one much later on, yeah. Also, some of these secret societies, they also develop these international secret student societies or fraternities. Right? These start appearing in the 1820s, 1830s as well, especially in Germany, in France, and then eventually in the United States. Sports societies, they could also be covers for promoting the spread of moderate or radical liberalism. So the whole movement to get the Olympics back in play is part of that. Gymnastics displays would become an occasion for meetings of revolutionary activity.
So actually, COVID helps.
Pardon?
COVID helps the people, not the discuss.
Yeah, or a funeral of someone that dies during COVID could be in a moment, for a breakout moment. Many of the first attempts in the 1820s, there are several minor revolts in the European countries, in Spain, in France, in Russia, southern France, the Papal States, the German kingdoms. A lot of these revolts are crushed immediately, and they lead actually in many cases to what we would call a maybe monarchical or conservative backlash.
Sorry, he is crushed by whom?
By the governments.
Monarchs. So the monarchs.
by the governments, or even the moderate liberals will crush them, right? But it works against the moderate liberals because so there, a lot of times the radical liberals would be the one promoting the revolts. The moderate liberals would crush the revolts, but then it would lead to a conservative backlash against the moderate liberals. So for example, by the mid-1820s, Ferdinand VII in Spain, who's a moderate liberal, just like Louis Philippe is a moderate liberal in France, he realizes he can't continue. And he does, somehow when he dies or when he steps away from the throne, the legitimate heir is Carlos. And Isabella is a young girl. She's 3 years old when Ferdinand VII leaves. So, but what ends up happening is that the various maneuverings around the throne, the liberals attach themselves to the 3-year-old Isabella. And they're able to somehow maneuver things. Charles is like a Catholic. He's super allied with the Pope. And he wants to restore Spain to its glory. But the liberals are able to kind of engineer things so that Charles cannot become king and Isabella becomes the queen, so that they can essentially rule for 20 years before she comes of age, where she can take rule, before she knows anything that's going on. And this is the origin of the Carlists. Very good. Excellent.
I'm not quite sure, but I've heard of these people.
You got it.
Carlists.
So basically, this is the origin of the Carlistas. So what is a Carlista? A Carlista essentially is someone who thinks that Charles is the legitimate heir of the throne and that he got duped.
They're all Bourbons.
Or he got coerced, basically. He got tricked. He got outmaneuvered by the liberal advisors of Isabella, who wanted to implement liberalism in Spain and prevent any kind of reestablishment of monarchical ultramontanism. So when I was in Madrid a couple years, in 2015 during my practicas, I was sat down for 3 hours by a Carlist. He teaches law at one of the universities in Madrid. And he went through the whole history with me, up to the bitter moments that we're in. So anyway, so there are still Carlists in Spain, but you'll see that, like if you read the Vasquez de Prada, you'll see that the Carlists are there among the groups that are involved in the Spanish Civil War. There's like 30 different factions by the time you get to the Spanish Civil War.
So they're not the nationalists or the Republicans.
Right. Also, by the mid-1830s, many of the radical liberals are deeply disappointed with moderate liberalism, and they're also deeply disappointed with any sort of monarchism or Catholicism. The radical liberals, for example, they call Lafayette, when the moderate liberals roll out Lafayette to try to give some sort of credence to their movement, the radical liberals call Lafayette a bumbling mummy because he's just like an old man from the days of the Revolution. So the radical liberals start to theorize that the only way to bring about true radical liberalism would be through some sort of democratic nationalism. Dun, dun, dun. That if you could establish free nations of people, right? If you could produce a breakthrough moment in any given nation, right? The breakthrough moment will never materialize under monarchy. It will never materialize under a Bonapartist. It will never materialize under moderate liberals. So you got to work on individual nations to create that breakthrough moment. And then once each individual nation produces that breakthrough moment where the people give expression to their true inner desires, will you be able then, if you have a number of nations that do this, could you bring together the free nations of Europe all as one? You can only produce this you can only also produce this breakthrough moment if you actually create the conditions in which the poor are free. The poor everywhere have to be given freedom. They also start to say, like Mazzini in Italy does this. Prati, in the Prati district in Rome, Prati was a theorist of this as well. They also start to argue that to really get this breakthrough moment, you need violence. And they start to argue there is such, if you look back to they use the American Revolution as their model here. They say if you look back to the American Revolution, the founding fathers of America were engaged in holy violence for freedom. Yes, they were engaged in terrorism. Yes, they harassed the British, but they did so in a way that enabled the emergence of sanctifying democracy. Out of these democratic nationalist movements, you'll see many strands emerge that are not always in agreement with each other, right? So, for example, I think you can see how National Socialism arises out of these movements. Also out of these movements will come out the anarchist movements of the 19th century. And even the anarchists will be divided into two groups. One brand of anarchism will follow P.J. Proudhon, which becomes kind of a libertarian anarchism. Another kind will become a violent anarchism, which is exemplified by Bakunin. Bakunin was one of the great violent 19th century anarchists. You'll see also there are movements in this time that will advocate guerrilla warfare, right? Like the junta that opposed Napoleon in Spain. The only way to bring about the new order of freedom would be through total guerrilla war. And again, some of these nationalists will divide whether this total guerrilla war is really worth it or not. One who says total guerrilla war is necessary is Garibaldi. And so from 1830 to 1833 in Italy, he attempts to engage in total guerrilla war against the Papal States. He's eventually reined in, and he's exiled from Italy. And where do they exile him to? Cha-cha-cha, cha-cha-cha-cha. Da, 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 da. Latin America, Mexico.
Oh, Mexico.
He goes to Latin America where he teaches the liberal National Socialists of Latin America how to engage in guerrilla war against the Catholic populations to bring liberals to power in Latin America. Isn't that Mexican music? Isn't it? So also in the mid-1830s, and I'll try to at least start it now. I'll give a quick summary now, and then hopefully I'll say more in the next class. It's in the mid-1830s you get the tile riots. The tile riots are what leads to the student revolts, which get depicted in Les Miserables. Okay, the tile riots, there's two tile riots, and I forget the exact years at this point, but basically, and the tile riots are in Lyon. They take place in Lyon. And they were publicized. They were publicized everywhere. So what happens in the tile riots? Essentially, Lyon is known for its textile mills. And there's a little bit of a depression in Lyon at some point, and all the owners of the textile mills get together, and they basically come to an agreement. We're going to drop our workers' salaries to a little bit lower than sustenance level. So they were already working a little bit above sustenance level, But lower than sustenance level means they can't even buy bread for their families anymore. So they do that, and then the workers revolt. The workers, these are just like blue-collar Catholic guys in Lyon. They're not intellectuals. They're not connected with Marxism. They're not connected with any of these movements really that I'm talking about. But they all revolt at the same time. And they succeed in driving the owners of the textile shops out of the city. And they basically drive the city government out of the city. And then they have the city, and then they kind of say, well, what do we do now? I mean, we didn't want to take over the city. We don't want to govern. We just want like enough money so we can buy bread for our families. So they come to some sort of an agreement where they agree not to drop their wages so low. A couple years pass, and in a couple years pass, and then kind of a similar, there's even a worse recession or maybe even a depression. And the textile owners all get together and they drop the wages again, right? They drop the wages back to less than sustenance level. So this time the workers, they take over the city, and as the police are leaving the city, the workers are on the roofs and they throw tiles down on the police and on the city government as they're leaving the city. This time, the textile workers appeal to Paris, and basically Paris sends in the troops. And I forget the exact numbers, but there's kind of, the typical, the reason that Paris sends in the troops is that I think it's especially in the second time that student groups throughout Europe basically go to the barricades for these tile workers, right? And so that's what leads to Les Miserables. At least the revolution we see in Les Miserables is actually the student revolts after the tile worker. But when the troops go into Lyon at the second time, they basically start shooting. And a number of these tile workers end up being slaughtered. And it leads to a kind of shock throughout Europe. And this shock has several consequences. One consequence is that those that want to advocate revolution realize in order for a revolution to happen, we need to unite the workers with the students. It leads also to a lot of socialists starting to think, we need to get together and we need to try to somehow convert the business class to socialism. And so you start to see a lot of the radical, especially the radical liberals, start to see in this confection of events an opportunity to basically think more deeply, but also try to get much more practical about how to implement socialism, how to protect the worker. It also leads to Catholics to start to think about how to side with the worker, really to prevent them from going over. People start to realize now the worker is going to become a target of the radicals. How do we protect the worker from going over to that position?